Political change, a new Europe. Whatever conservative statesmen hoped in 1815, an uncomfortable and turbulent era had only just begun. This can be seen most easily in the way the map of Europe changed in the next 60 years. By 1871, when a newly united Germany took its place among the great powers, most of Europe west of a line drawn from the Adriatic to the Baltic was organized in states that claimed to be based on the principle of nationality, even if some minorities still denied it. Even to the east of that line there were some states which were already identified with nations. By 1914 the triumph of nationalism was to go further still, and most of the Balkans would be organized as nation-states, too. Nationalism, one aspect of a new kind of politics, had origins which went back a long way, to the examples set in Great Britain and some of Europe's smaller states in earlier times. Yet its great triumphs were to come after 1815, as part of the appearance of a new politics. At their heart lay an acceptance of a new framework of thought which recognized the existence of a public interest greater than that of individual rulers or privileged hierarchies. It also assumed that competition to define and protect that interest was legitimate. Such competition was thought increasingly to require special arenas and institutions. Old juridical or courtly forms no longer seemed sufficient to settle political questions. An institutional framework for this transformation of public life took longer to emerge in some countries than others. Even in the most advanced it cannot be identified with any single set of practices. It always tended, though, to be strongly linked with the recognition and promotion of certain principles. Nationalism was one of them which went most against older principles, that of dynasticism, for instance. It was more and more a commonplace of European political discourse, as the 19th century went on, that the interests of those recognized to be historic nations should be protected and promoted by governments. This was, of course, wholly compatible with bitter and prolonged disagreement about which nations were historic, how their interests should be defined, and to what extent they could and should be given weight in statesmen's decisions. There were also other principles in play besides nationalism. Terms like democracy and liberalism do not help very much in defining them, though they must be used in default of better ones and because contemporaries used them. In most countries there was a general trend towards accepting representative institutions as a way of associating, even if only formally, more and more people with the government. Liberals and Democrats almost always asked for more people to be given votes and for better electoral representation. More and more, too, the individual became the basis of political and social organization in economically advanced countries. The individual's membership of communal, religious, occupational and family units came to matter much less than his or her individual rights. Though this led in some ways to greater freedom, it sometimes led to less. The state became much more juridically powerful in relation to its subjects in the 19th century than ever before, and slowly, as its apparatus became technically more efficient, came to be able to coerce them more effectively. The French Revolution had been of enormous importance in actually launching such changes, but its continuing influence as example and a source of mythology mattered just as much. For all the hopes and fears that the revolution was over by 1815, its full Europe-wide impact was then still to come. In many other countries, institutions already swept away in France invited criticism and demolition. They were the more vulnerable because other forces of economic and social change were also at work. This gave revolutionary ideas and traditions new opportunities. There was a widespread sense that all Europe faced, for good or ill, potential revolution. This encouraged both the upholders and would-be destroyers of the existing order to sharpen political issues and fit them into the frameworks of the principles of 1789, nationalism and liberalism. By and large, these ideas dominated the history of Europe down to about 1870 and provided the dynamic of its politics. They did not achieve all their advocates hoped. Their realization in practice had many qualifications. They frequently and thwartingly got in one another's way, and they had many opponents. Yet they remain useful guiding threads in the rich and turbulent history of 19th century Europe, already a political laboratory whose experiments, explosions and discoveries were changing the history of the rest of the world. These influences could already be seen at work in the negotiations shaping the foundation deed of the 19th century international order, the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, which closed the era of the French Wars. Its central aim was to prevent their repetition. The peacemakers sought the containment of France and the avoidance of revolution, using as their materials the principle of legitimacy, which was the ideological core of conservative Europe, and certain practical territorial arrangements against future French aggression. Thus Prussia was given large acquisitions on the Rhine, a new northern state appeared under a Dutch king, ruling both Belgium and the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Sardinia was given Genoa, and Austria not only recovered her former Italian possessions, but kept Venice and was allowed a virtually free hand in keeping the other Italian states in order. In many of these cases legitimacy bowed to expediency. Those despoiled during the years of upheaval did not all obtain restoration. But the powers talked legitimacy all the same, and, once the arrangements were complete, did so with some success. For nearly 40 years the Vienna Settlement provided a framework within which disputes were settled without war. Most of the regimes installed in 1815 were still there, even if some of them were somewhat shaken, 40 years later. This owed much to the salutary fear of revolution. In all the major continental states the Restoration era, as the years after 1815 have been termed, was a great period for policemen and plotters alike. Secret societies proliferated, undiscouraged by failure after failure. This record showed, though, that there was no subversive threat that could not be handled easily enough. Austrian troops dealt with attempted coups in Piedmont and Naples. French soldiers restored the power of a reactionary Spanish king hampered by a liberal constitution. The Russian Empire survived a military conspiracy and a Polish revolt. The Austrian predominance in Germany was not threatened at all, and it is difficult in retrospect to discern any very real danger to any part of the Habsburg monarchy before 1848. Russian and Austrian power, the first in reserve, the second the main force in Central Europe and Italy from 1815 to 1848, were the two rocks on which the Vienna system rested. Mistakenly, liberalism and nationalism were usually supposed to be inseparable. This was to prove terribly untrue in later times, but in so far as a few people did seek to change Europe by revolution before 1848, it is broadly true that they wanted to do so by advancing both the political principles of the French Revolution, representative government, popular sovereignty, freedom of the individual and the press, and those of nationality. Many confused the two. The most famous and admired of those who did so was Giuseppe Mazzini, a young Italian. By advocating an Italian unity most of his countrymen did not want and conspiring unsuccessfully to bring it about, he became an inspiration and model for other nationalists and democrats in every continent for over a century, and one of the first idols of radical chic. The age of the ideas he represented had not yet come, though. To the west of the Rhine, where the writ of the Holy Alliance, the term given to the group of three conservative powers, Russia, Austria and Prussia, did not run, the story was different. Their legitimism was not to last long. The very restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in 1814 had itself been a compromise with the principle of legitimacy. Louis XVIII was supposed to have reigned like any other king of France since the death of his predecessor, Louis XVII, in a Paris prison in 1795. In fact, as everyone knew but legitimists tried to conceal, he came back in the baggage train of the Allied armies which had defeated Napoleon, and he only did so on terms acceptable to the French political and military elites of the Napoleonic period and, presumably, tolerable to the mass of Frenchmen. The restored regime was regulated by a charter which created a constitutional monarchy, albeit with a limited suffrage. The rights of individuals were guaranteed and the land settlement resulting from revolutionary confiscations and sales was unquestioned. There was to be no return to 1789. Nevertheless, there was some uncertainty about the future. Battle between right and left began with arguments about the charter itself. Was it a contract between king and people, or a simple emanation of the royal benevolence, which might therefore be withdrawn as easily as it had been granted? And went on over a whole range of issues which raised questions of principle, or were thought to do so, about ground won for liberty and the possessing classes in the Revolution. What was implicitly at stake was what the revolution had actually achieved. One way of describing that would be to say that those who had struggled to be recognized as having a voice in ruling France under the Ancien regime had won. The political weight of the notables, as they were sometimes called, was assured, and they, whether drawn from the old nobility of France, those who had done well out of the revolution, Napoleon's lackeys, or simply substantial landowners and businessmen, were now the real rulers of France. Another change had been the nation-making brought about in French institutions. No person or corporation could now claim to stand outside the operative sphere of the national government of France. Finally and crucially, the revolution had changed political thinking. Among other things, the terms in which French public affairs would be discussed and debated had been transformed. Wherever the line was to be drawn between right and left, conservatives or liberals, it was on that line that political battle now had to be centered, not over the privilege of counseling a monarch by divine right. This was just what the last king of the direct Bourbon line, Charles X, failed to see. He foolishly attempted to break out of the constitutional limitations which bound him, by what was virtually a coup d'état. Paris rose against him in the July Revolution of 1830. Liberal politicians hastily put themselves at its head and, to the chagrin of Republicans, ensured that a new king replaced Charles. Louis-Philippe was head of the junior branch of the French royal house, the Orleans family, but to many conservative eyes he was the revolution incarnate. His father had voted for the execution of Louis XVI, and went to the scaffold himself soon after, while the new king had fought as an officer in the Republican armies. He had even been a member of the notorious Jacobin Club, which was widely believed to have been a deep-rooted conspiracy, and certainly had been a forcing house for some of the revolution's most prominent leaders. To liberals, Louis-Philippe was attractive for much the same reasons. He reconciled the revolution with the stability provided by monarchy, though those more on the left were disappointed. The regime over which he was to preside for 18 years proved unimpeachably constitutional and preserved essential political freedoms, but protected the interests of the well-to-do. It vigorously suppressed urban disorder, of which poverty produced plenty in the 1830s, and this made it unpopular with the left. One prominent politician told his fellow countrymen to enrich themselves, a recommendation much ridiculed and misunderstood. Although all he was trying to do was to tell them that the way to obtain the vote was through the qualification which a high income conferred. In 1830 only about a third as many Frenchmen as Englishmen had a vote for their national representatives, while the population of France was about twice that of England. Nevertheless, in theory, the July monarchy rested on popular sovereignty, the revolutionary principle of 1789. This gave it a certain special international standing in a Europe divided by ideology. In the 1830s there were sharply evident differences between a Europe of constitutional states, England, France, Spain and Portugal, and that of the legitimist, dynastic states of the East, with their Italian and German satellites. Conservative governments had not liked the July Revolution. They were alarmed when the Belgians rebelled against their Dutch king in 1830, but could not support him, because the British and French favored the Belgians and Russia had a Polish rebellion on her hands. It took until 1839 to secure the establishment of an independent Belgium, and this was until 1848 the only important change in the state system created by the Vienna Settlement, although the internal troubles of Spain and Portugal caused ripples which troubled European diplomacy. Elsewhere, in Southeast Europe, the pace of change was quickening. A new revolutionary era was opening there just as that of Western Europe moved to its climax. In 1804 a well-to-do Serbian pork dealer had led a revolt by his countrymen against the undisciplined Turkish garrison of Belgrade. At that moment, the Ottoman regime was willing to countenance his actions in order to bridle its own mutinous soldiers and put down the Christian peasants who set about the massacre of urban Muslims. But the eventual cost to the empire was the establishment of an autonomous Serbian princedom in 1817. By then the Turks had also ceded Bessarabia, the region between the Dniester and Pruth rivers, to Russia, and had been forced to recognize that their hold on much of Greece and Albania was little more than formal, real power being in the hands of the local pashas. This was, though hardly yet visibly so, the opening of the Eastern Question of the 19th century, who or what was to inherit the fragments of the crumbling Ottoman Empire. In Europe it preoccupied the powers for more than a century. In the Balkans and what were the Asiatic provinces of the empire, wars of the Ottoman succession are still going on today. Racial, religious, ideological and diplomatic issues were entangled from the start. The Ottoman territories were populated by peoples and communities scattered over wide areas in logic-defying patterns, and the Vienna Settlement did not include them among those it covered by guarantees of the great powers. When there began what was represented as a revolution of Greeks, that is, Orthodox Christian subjects of the Sultan, some of whose leaders were bandits and pirates, against Ottoman rule in 1821, Russia abandoned her conservative principles and favored the rebels. Religion and the old pull of Russian strategic aims towards southeastern Europe made it impossible for the Holy Alliance to support an Islamic ruler as it did other rulers, and in the end the Russians even went to war with the Sultan. The new Kingdom of Greece, which emerged in 1832, its borders settled by outsiders, was bound to give ideas to other Balkan peoples, and it was evident that the 19th century Eastern Question was going to be complicated by the specious claims of nationalism as it had not been in the 18th century. The outlook was not good, for at its outset the Greek revolt had prompted massacres of Greeks by Turks in Constantinople and Smyrna, to be followed, rapidly, by Greek massacres of Turks in the Peloponnese. The problems of the next 2 centuries in the Balkans were poisoned at their roots by such examples of what would later be called ethnic cleansing. In 1848 came a new revolutionary explosion. Briefly, it seemed that the whole 1815 settlement was in jeopardy. The 1840s had been years of economic hardship, food shortages and distress in many places, particularly in Ireland where, in 1846, there was a great famine, and then in Central Europe and France in 1847, where a commercial slump starved the cities. Unemployment was widespread. This bred violence which gave a new edge to radical movements everywhere. One disturbance inspired another. Example was contagious and weakened the capacity of the international security system to deal with further outbreaks. The symbolic start came in February, in Paris, where Louis-Philippe abdicated after discovering the middle classes would no longer support his continued opposition to the extension of the suffrage. By the middle of the year, government had been swept aside or was at best on the defensive in every major European capital except London and St. Petersburg. When a republic appeared in France after the February Revolution, every revolutionary and political exile in Europe had taken heart. The dreams of 30 years' conspiracies seemed realizable. The Grande Nation would be on the move again, and the armies of the Great Revolution might march once more to spread its principles. What happened, though, was very different. France made a diplomatic genuflection in the direction of martyred Poland, the classical focus of liberal sympathies, but the only military operations it undertook were in defense of the Pope, an unimpeachably conservative cause. This was symptomatic. The revolutionaries of 1848 were provoked by very different situations, had many different aims, and followed divergent and confusing paths. In most of Italy and Central Europe they rebelled against governments which they thought oppressive because they were illiberal. There, the great symbolic demand was for constitutions to guarantee essential freedoms. When such a revolution occurred in Vienna itself, the Chancellor, Metternich, the architect of the conservative order of 1815, fled into exile. Successful revolution at Vienna meant the paralysis, and therefore the dislocation, of the whole of Central Europe. Germans were now free to have their revolutions without fear of Austrian intervention in support of the Ancien regime. In the smaller states, so were other peoples within the Austrian dominions. Italians, led by an ambitious but apprehensive conservative king of Sardinia, turned on the Austrian armies in Lombardy and Venetia. Hungarians revolted at Budapest, and Czechs at Prague. This much complicated things. Many of these revolutionaries wanted national independence rather than constitutionalism, though constitutionalism seemed for a time the way to independence because it attacked dynastic autocracy. If the liberals were successful in getting constitutional governments installed in all the capitals of Central Europe and Italy, then it followed there would actually come into existence nations hitherto without state structures of their own, or at least without them for a very long time. If Slavs achieved their own national liberation, then states previously thought of as German would be shorn of huge tracts of their territory, notably in Poland and Bohemia. It took some time for this to sink in. The German liberals suddenly fell over this problem in 1848 and quickly drew their conclusions. They chose nationalism. The Italians were still grappling with their own version of the dilemma in the South Tyrol 100 years later. The German revolutions of 1848 failed, essentially, because the German liberals decided that German nationalism required the preservation of German lands in the East. Hence, they needed a strong Prussia and must accept its terms for the future of Germany. There were other signs, too, that the tide had turned before the end of 1848. The Austrian army had mastered the Italians. In Paris, a rising that aimed to give the revolution a further shove in the direction of democracy was crushed with great bloodshed in June. The Republic was, after all, to be a conservative one. In 1849 came the end. The Austrians overthrew the Sardinian army, which was the only shield of the Italian revolutions, and monarchs all over the peninsula then began to withdraw the constitutional concessions they had made while Austrian power was in abeyance. German rulers did the same, led by Prussia. The pressure was kept up on the Habsburgs by the Croats and Hungarians, but then the Russian army came to its allies' help. Liberals saw 1848 as a springtime of the nations. If it was one, the shoots had not lived long before they withered. By the end of 1849, the formal structure of Europe was once again much as it had been in 1847, in spite of important changes within some countries. Nationalism had certainly been a popular cause in 1848, but it had been neither strong enough to sustain revolutionary governments nor obviously an enlightened force. Its failure shows that the charge that the statesmen of 1815 neglected to give it due attention is false. No new nation emerged from 1848, for none was ready to do so. The basic reason for this was that although nationalities might exist, over most of Europe nationalism was still an abstraction for the masses. Only relatively few and well-educated, or at least half-educated, people much cared about it. Where national differences also embodied social issues, there was sometimes effective action by people who felt they had an identity given them by language, tradition or religion, but it did not lead to the setting up of new nations. The Ruthene peasants of Galicia in 1847 had happily murdered their Polish landlords when the Habsburg administration allowed them to do so. Having thus satisfied themselves, they remained loyal to the Habsburgs in 1848. There were some genuinely popular risings in 1848. In Italy, they were usually revolts of townsmen rather than peasants. The Lombard peasants, indeed, cheered the Austrian army when it returned, because they saw no good for them in a revolution led by the aristocrats who were their landlords. In parts of Germany, over much of which the traditional structures of landed rural society remained intact, the peasants behaved as their predecessors had done in France in 1789, burning their landlords' houses, not merely through personal animus but in order to destroy the hated and feared records of rents, dues and labor services. Such outbreaks frightened urban liberals as much as the Parisian outbreak of despair and unemployment in the June days frightened the middle classes in France. There, because the peasant was since 1789, speaking broadly, a conservative, the government was assured of the support of the provinces in crushing the Parisian poor who had given radicalism its brief success. But conservatism could be found within revolutionary movements, too. German working-class turbulence alarmed the better off, but this was because the leaders of German workers talked of socialism while actually seeking a return to the past. They had the safe world of guilds and apprenticeships in mind, and feared machinery in factories, steamboats on the Rhine, which put boatmen out of work, and the opening of unrestricted entry to trades, in short, the all-too-evident signs of the onset of market society. Almost always, liberalism's lack of appeal to the masses was shown up in 1848 by popular revolution. Altogether, the social importance of 1848 is as complex and escapes easy generalization as much as its political content. It was probably in the countryside of Eastern and Central Europe that the revolutions changed society most. There, liberal principles and the fear of popular revolt went hand in hand to impose change on the landlords. Wherever outside Russia obligatory peasant labor and bondage to the soil survived, it was abolished as a result of 1848. That year carried the Rural Social Revolution, launched 60 years earlier in France, to its conclusion in Central and most of Eastern Europe. The way was now open for the reconstruction of agricultural life in Germany and the Danube Valley on individualist and market lines. Though many of its practices and habits of mind were still to linger, feudal society was in effect now coming to an end all over Europe. The political components of French revolutionary principles, though, would have to wait longer for their expression. In the case of nationalism, this was not very long. A dispute over Russian influence in the Near East in 1854 ended the long peace between the great powers which had lasted since 1815. The Crimean War, in which the French and British fought as allies of the Ottoman Sultan against the Russians, was in many ways a notable struggle. Fighting took place in the Baltic, in southern Russia and in the Crimea, the last theatre attracting most attention. There, the Allies had set themselves to capture Sebastopol, the naval base which was the key to Russian power in the Black Sea. Some of the results were surprising. The British Army fought gallantly, as did its opponents and allies, but was especially distinguished by the inadequacy of its administrative arrangements. The scandal these caused launched an important wave of radical reform at home. Incidentally, the war also helped to found the prestige of a new profession for women, that of nursing, for the collapse of British medical services had been particularly striking. Florence Nightingale's work launched the first major extension of the occupational opportunities available to respectable women since the creation of female religious communities in the Dark Ages. The conduct of the war is also noteworthy in another way as an index of modernity. It was the first between major powers in which steamships and a railway were employed, and it brought the electric telegraph cable to Istanbul. Some of these things were portentous. Yet they mattered less in the short run than what the war did to international relations. Russia was defeated, and her long enjoyment of a power to intimidate Turkey was bridled for a time. A step was taken towards the establishment of another new Christian nation, Romania, which was finally brought about in 1862. Once more, nationality triumphed in former Ottoman lands. But the crucial effect of the war was that the Holy Alliance had disappeared. The old rivalry of the 18th century between Austria and Russia over what would happen to the Ottoman inheritance in the Balkans had broken out again when Austria warned Russia not to occupy the Danube Principalities, as the future Romania was termed, during the war, and then occupied them herself. This was 5 years after Russia had intervened to restore Habsburg power by crushing the Hungarian Revolution. It was the end of friendship between the two powers. The next time Austria faced a threat, she would have to do so without the Russian policeman of conservative Europe at her side. In 1856, when peace was made, few people can have anticipated how quickly that time would come. Within 10 years Austria lost in 2 short, sharp wars her hegemony both in Italy and in Germany, and those countries were united in new national states. Nationalism had indeed triumphed, and at the cost of the Habsburgs, as had been prophesied by enthusiasts in 1848, but in a totally unexpected way. Not revolution, but the ambitions of 2 traditionally expansive monarchical states, Sardinia and Prussia, had led each to set about improving its position at the expense of Austria, whose isolation was at that moment complete. Not only had she sacrificed the Russian alliance, but after 1852 France was ruled by an emperor who again bore the name Napoleon. He was the nephew of the first to do so. He had been elected president of the Second Republic, whose constitution he then set aside by coup d'état. The name Napoleon was itself terrifying. It suggested a program of international reconstruction, or revolution. Napoleon III, the second was a legal fiction, a son of Napoleon I who had never ruled, stood for the destruction of the anti-French settlement of 1815 and therefore of the Austrian predominance which propped it up in Italy and Germany. He talked the language of nationalism with less inhibition than most rulers and seems to have believed in it. With arms and diplomacy he forwarded the work of two great diplomatic technicians, Claude and Bismarck, the prime ministers respectively of Sardinia and of Prussia. In 1859 Sardinia and France fought Austria. After a brief war the Austrians were left with only Venetia in Italy. Claude now set to work to incorporate other Italian states into Sardinia, a part of the price being that Sardinian Savoy had to be given to France. Claude died in 1861, and debate still continues over what the real extent of his aims were, but by 1871 his successors had produced a united Italy under the former King of Sardinia, who was thus recompensed for the loss of Savoy, the ancestral duchy of his house. In that year Germany was united, too. Bismarck had begun by rallying German liberal sentiment to the Prussian cause once again in a nasty little war against Denmark in 1864. 2 years later Prussia defeated Austria in a lightning campaign in Bohemia, thus at last ending the Hohenzollern-Habsburg duel for supremacy in Germany begun in 1740 by Frederick II. The war which did this was rather a registration of an accomplished fact than its achievement, for since 1848 Austria had been much weakened in German affairs. In that year, German liberals had offered a German crown, not to the emperor, but to the King of Prussia. Nevertheless, some states had still looked to Vienna for leadership and patronage, and they were now left alone to meet Prussian bullying. The Habsburg Empire now became wholly Danubian, its foreign policy preoccupied with Southeast Europe and the Balkans. It had retired from the Netherlands in 1815, Venetia had been exacted by the Prussians for the Italians in 1866, and now it left Germany to its own devices, too. Immediately after the peace the Hungarians seized the opportunity to inflict a further defeat on the humiliated monarchy by obtaining a virtual autonomy for the half of the Habsburg monarchy made up of the lands of the Hungarian crown. The empire thus became, in 1867, the dual or Austro-Hungarian monarchy, divided rather untidily into two halves linked by little more than the dynasty itself and the conduct of a common foreign policy. German unification required one further step. It had gradually dawned on France that the assertion of Prussian power beyond the Rhine was not in the French interest. Instead of a disputed Germany, she now faced one dominated by an important military power. The Richelieu era had crumbled away unnoticed. Bismarck used this new awareness, together with Napoleon III's weakness at home and international isolation, to provoke France into a foolish declaration of war in 1870. Victory in this conflict set the coping stone on the new edifice of German nationality, for Prussia had taken the lead in defending Germany against France, and there were still Germans alive who could remember what French armies had done in Germany under an earlier Napoleon. The Prussian army destroyed the Second Empire in France. It was to be the last monarchical regime in that country, and created the German Empire, the Second Reich, as it was called, to distinguish it from the medieval empire. In practice, it was a Prussian domination cloaked in federal forms, but as a German national state it satisfied many German liberals. It was dramatically and appropriately founded in 1871 when the King of Prussia accepted the crown of United Germany, which his predecessor had refused to take from German liberals in 1848, from his fellow princes in the palace of Louis XIV at Versailles. There had thus been in 50 years a revolution in international affairs, and it would have great consequences for world, as well as European, history. Germany had replaced France as the dominant land power in Europe, as France had replaced Spain in the 17th century. This fact was to overshadow Europe's international relations until they ceased to be determined by forces originating within her. It owed just a little to revolutionary politics in the narrow and strict sense. The conscious revolutionaries of the 19th century had achieved nothing comparable with the work of Claude, Bismarck and, half in spite of himself, Napoleon III. This is very odd, given the hopes entertained of revolution in this period, and the fears felt for it. Revolution had achieved little except at the fringes of Europe and had even begun to show signs of flagging. Down to 1848 there had been plenty of revolutions, to say nothing of plots, conspiracies and pronunciamientos, which did not justify the name. After 1848 there were very few. Another Polish Revolution took place in 1863, but this was the only outbreak of note in the lands of the great powers until 1871. An ebbing of revolutionary effort by then is understandable. Revolutions seemed to have achieved little outside France, and they had brought disillusion and dictatorship. Some of their goals were being achieved in other ways. Cavour and his followers had created a united Italy, after all, greatly to the chagrin of Mazzini, since it was not one of which that revolutionary could approve, and Bismarck had done what many of the German liberals of 1848 had hoped for by providing a Germany which was indisputably a great power. Other ends were being achieved by economic progress. For all the horrors of the poverty which it contained, 19th-century Europe was getting richer and was giving more and more of its peoples a larger share of its wealth. Even quite short-term factors helped here. The year 1848 was soon followed by the great gold discoveries of California, which provided a flow of bullion to stimulate the world economy in the 1850s and 1860s. Confidence grew and unemployment fell in these decades, and this was good for social peace. A more fundamental reason why revolutions were less frequent was, perhaps, that they became more difficult to carry out. Governments were finding it steadily easier to grapple with them, largely for technical reasons. The 19th century created modern police forces. Better communications by rail and telegraph gave new power to central government in dealing with distant revolt. Above all, armies had a growing technical superiority to rebellion. As early as 1795, a French government showed that once it had control of the regular armed forces, and was prepared to use them, it could master Paris. During the long peace from 1815 to 1848, many European armies in fact became much more instruments of security, directed potentially against their own populations, than means of international competition, directed against foreign enemies. It was only the defection of important sections of the armed forces which permitted successful revolution in Paris in 1830 and 1848. Once such forces were available to the government, battles like that of the June days of 1848, which one observer called the greatest slave war in history, could only end with the defeat of the rebels. From that year, indeed, no popular revolution was ever to succeed in a major European country against a government whose control of its armed forces was unshaken by defeat in war or by subversion, and which was determined to use its power. This was vividly and bloodily demonstrated in 1871, when a rebellious Paris was once again crushed by a French government in little more than a week, with a toll of dead as great as that exacted by the Terror of 1793-4. A popular regime, which drew to itself a wide range of radicals and reformers, set itself up in the capital as the Commune of Paris, a name evocative of traditions of municipal independence going back to the Middle Ages and, more important, to 1793, when the Commune, or City Council, of Paris had been the center of revolutionary fervor. The Commune of 1871 was able to take power because in the aftermath of defeat by the Germans the government could not disarm the capital of the weapons with which it had successfully withstood a siege, and because the same defeat had inflamed many Parisians against the government they believed to have let them down. During its brief life, there were a few weeks of quiet while the government prepared its repast. The Commune did very little, but it produced a lot of left-wing rhetoric and was soon seen as the embodiment of social revolution. This gave additional bitterness to the efforts to suppress it. They came when the government had reassembled its forces from returning prisoners of war to reconquer Paris, which became the scene of brief but bloody street fighting. Once again, regularly constituted armed forces overcame workmen and shopkeepers manning hastily improvised barricades. If anything could do so, the ghastly failure of the Paris Commune should have killed the revolutionary myth, both in its power to terrify and its power to inspire. Yet it did not. If anything, it strengthened it. Conservatives found it a great standby to have the Commune example to hand in evoking the dangers lurking, always ready to burst out from under the surface of society. Revolutionaries had a new episode of heroism and martyrdom to add to an apostolic succession of revolutionaries running already from 1789 to 1848. But the Commune also revivified the revolutionary mythology because of a new factor whose importance had already struck both left and right. This was socialism. This word, like its relative, socialist, has come to encompass a great many different things, and did so almost from the start. Both words were first commonly used in France around about 1830 to describe theories and men opposed to a society run on market principles and to an economy operated on laissez-faire lines, of which the main beneficiaries, they thought, were the wealthy. Economic and social egalitarianism is fundamental to the socialist idea. Most socialists have been able to agree on that. They have usually believed that in a good society there would be no classes oppressing one another through the advantages given to one by the ownership of wealth. All socialists, too, could agree that there was nothing sacred about property, whose rights buttressed injustice. Some sought its complete abolition and were called communists. Property is theft was one very successful slogan. Such ideas might be frightening to the bourgeoisie, but they were not very novel. Egalitarian ideas have fascinated men throughout history, and the Christian rulers of Europe had managed without difficulty to reconcile social arrangements resting on sharp contrasts of wealth with the practice of a religion one of whose greatest hymns praised God for filling the hungry with good things and sending the rich away empty. What happened in the early 19th century was that such ideas seemed to become at once more potent, linked to the idea of revolution in the new style, and more widespread. There was also a need for new thinking because of other developments. One was that the success of liberal political reform appeared to show that legal equality was not enough, if it was deprived of content by dependence on the economically powerful, or denatured by poverty and attendant ignorance. Another was that already in the 18th century a few thinkers had seen big discrepancies of wealth as irrationalities in a world which could and should, they thought, be regulated to produce the greatest good of the greatest number. In the French Revolution some thinkers and agitators already pressed forward demands in which later generations would see socialist ideas. Egalitarian ideas nonetheless only became socialism in a modern sense when they began to grapple with the problems of the new epoch of economic and social change, above all with those presented by industrialization. This often required a great perspicacity, for these changes were very slow in making their impact outside Great Britain and Belgium, the first continental country to be industrialized in the same degree. Yet perhaps because the contrast they presented with traditional society was so stark, even the small beginnings of concentration in capitalist finance and manufacturing were remarked. One of the first men to grasp their potentially very great implications for social organization was a French nobleman, Claude Saint-Simon. His seminal contribution to socialist thought was to consider the impact on society of technological and scientific advance. Saint-Simon thought that they not only made planned organization of the economy imperative, but implied, indeed, demanded, the replacement of the traditional ruling classes, aristocratic and rural in their outlook, by elites representing new economic and intellectual forces. Such ideas influenced many thinkers, most of them French, who in the 1830s advocated greater egalitarianism. They seemed to show that on rational as well as ethical grounds such change was desirable. Their doctrines made enough impact and their considerations were enough talked about to terrify the French possessing classes in 1848, who thought they saw in the June days a socialist revolution. Socialists identified themselves for the most part with the tradition of the French Revolution, picturing the realization of their ideals as its next phase, so the misinterpretation is understandable. In 1848, at this juncture, there appeared a pamphlet which is the most important document in the history of socialism. It is always known as the Communist Manifesto, though this was not the title under which it was published. It was largely the work of a young German of Jewish birth, though himself baptized, Karl Marx, and with it the point is reached at which the prehistory of socialism can be separated from its history. Marx proclaimed a complete break with what he called the utopian socialism of his predecessors. Utopian socialists attacked industrial capitalism because they thought it was unjust. Marx thought this beside the point. Nothing, according to Marx, could be hoped for from arguments to persuade people that change was morally desirable. Everything depended on the way history was going, towards the actual and inevitable creation of a new working class by industrial society, the rootless wage earners of the new industrial cities, which he termed the Industrial Proletariat. This class was bound, according to Marx, to act in a revolutionary way. History was working upon the proletariat so as to generate revolutionary capacity and mentality. It would present them with conditions to which revolution was the only logical outcome, and that revolution would be, by those conditions, guaranteed success. What mattered was not that capitalism was morally wrong, but that it was already out of date and therefore historically doomed. Marx asserted that every society had a particular system of property rights and class relationships, and these accordingly shaped its particular political arrangements. Politics were bound to express economic forces. They would change as the particular organization of society changed under the influence of economic developments, and therefore, sooner or later, and Marx seems to have thought sooner, revolution would sweep away capitalist society and its forms, as capitalist society had already swept away feudal. There was much more to Marx than this, but this was a striking and encouraging message which gave him domination of the international socialist movement that emerged in the next 20 years. The assurance that history was on their side was a great tonic to revolutionaries. They learnt with gratitude that the cause to which they were impelled anyway by motives ranging from a sense of injustice to the promptings of envy was predestined to triumph. This was essentially a faith, though Marx's adherents believed it to be a science. For all its intellectual possibilities as an analytical instrument, Marxism came to be above all a popular mythology, resting on a view of history which said that men were bound by necessity because their institutions were determined by the evolving methods of production, and on a faith that the working class were the chosen people, whose pilgrimage through a wicked world would end in the triumphal establishment of a just society in which necessity's iron law would cease to operate. Social revolutionaries could thus feel confident of scientifically irrefutable arguments for irresistible progress towards the socialist millennium, while clinging to a revolutionary activism it seemed to make unnecessary. Marx himself seems to have followed his teaching more cautiously, applying it only to the broad, sweeping changes in history which individuals are powerless to resist and not to its detailed unfolding. Perhaps it is not surprising that, like many masters, he did not recognize all his pupils. He came later to protest that he was not a Marxist. This new religion was an inspiration to working-class organization. Trades unions and cooperatives already existed in some countries. The first international organization of working men appeared in 1863. Though it included many who did not subscribe to Marx's views, anarchists, among others, his influence was paramount within it. He was its secretary. Its name frightened conservatives, some of whom blamed the Paris Commune on it. Whatever their justification, their instincts were right. What happened in the years after 1848 was that socialism captured the revolutionary tradition from the liberals, and a belief in the historical role of an industrial working class, still barely visible outside England, let alone predominant in most countries, was tacked onto the tradition which held that, broadly speaking, revolution could not be wrong. Forms of thinking about politics evolved in the French Revolution were thus transferred to societies to which they would prove increasingly inappropriate. How easy such a transition could be was shown by the way Marx snapped up the drama and mythical exaltation of the Paris Commune for socialism. In a powerful tract he annexed it to his own theories, though it was, in fact, the product of many complicated and differing forces and expressed very little in the way of egalitarianism, let alone scientific socialism. It emerged, moreover, in a city which, though huge, was not one of the great manufacturing centers in which he predicted proletarian revolution would mature. These remained, instead, stubbornly quiescent. The Commune was, in fact, the last and greatest example of revolutionary and traditional Parisian radicalism. It was a great failure, and socialism suffered from it, too, because of the repressive measures it provoked. Yet Marx made it central to socialist mythology. Russia seemed, except in her Polish lands, immune to the disturbances troubling other continental great powers. The French Revolution had been another of those experiences which, like feudalism, Renaissance or Reformation, decisively shaped Western Europe and passed Russia by. Although Alexander I, the Tsar under whom Russia met the 1812 invasion, had indulged himself with liberal ideas and had even thought of a constitution, nothing seemed to come of this. A formal liberalization of Russian institutions did not begin until the 1860s, and even then its source was not revolutionary contagion. It is true that liberalism and revolutionary ideologies did not quite leave Russia untouched before this. Alexander's reign had seen something of an opening of a Pandora's box of ideas, and it had thrown up a small group of critics of the regime who found their models in Western Europe. Some of the Russian officers who went there with the armies which pursued Napoleon to Paris were led by what they saw and heard to make unfavorable comparisons with their homeland. This was the beginning of Russian political opposition. In an autocracy, opposition was bound to mean conspiracy. Some of them took part in the organization of secret societies, which attempted a coup amid the uncertainty caused by the death of Alexander in 1825. This was called the Decembrist movement. It soon collapsed, but only after giving a fright to Nicholas I, a Tsar who decisively and negatively affected Russia's historical destiny at a crucial moment by ruthlessly turning on political liberalism and seeking to crush it. In part because of the immobility which he imposed, Nicholas's reign influenced Russia's destiny more than any since that of Peter the Great. A dedicated believer in autocracy, he confirmed the Russian tradition of authoritarian bureaucracy, the management of cultural life and the rule of the secret police just when the other great conservative powers were, however unwillingly, beginning to move in the opposite direction. There was, of course, much to build on already in the historical legacies which differentiated Russian autocracy from Western European monarchy. But there were also great challenges to be met, and Nicholas's reign was a response to these as well as a simple deployment of the old methods of despotism by a man determined to use them. The ethnic, linguistic and geographical diversity of the empire had begun to pose problems far outrunning the capacity of Muscovite tradition to deal with them. The population of the empire itself more than doubled in the 40 years after 1770. This ever-diversifying society nonetheless remained overwhelmingly backward. Its few cities were hardly a part of the vast rural expanses in which they stood and often seemed insubstantial and impermanent, more like huge temporary encampments than settled centers of civilization. The greatest expansion had been to the south and southeast. Here new elites had to be incorporated into the imperial structure, and to stress the religious ties between the Orthodox was one of the easiest ways to do this. As the conflict with Napoleon had compromised the old prestige of things French and the skeptical ideas of the Enlightenment associated with that country, a new emphasis was now given to religion in the evolution of a new ideological basis for the Russian Empire under Nicholas. Official nationality, as it was called, was Slavophile and religious in doctrine, bureaucratic in form, and strove to give Russia an ideological unity it had lost since outgrowing its historic center in Muscovy. The importance of official ideology was from this time one of the great differences between Russia and Western Europe. Until the last decade of the 20th century, Russian governments were never to give up their belief in ideology as a unifying force. Yet this did not mean that daily life in the middle of the 19th century, either for the civilized classes or the mass of a backward population, was much different from that of other parts of Eastern and Central Europe. Yet Russian intellectuals argued about whether or not Russia was a European country, and this is not surprising. Russia's roots were different from those of countries further west. What is more, a decisive turn was taken under Nicholas, from the beginning of whose reign possibilities of change that were at least being felt in other dynastic states in the first half of the 19th century, were simply not allowed to appear in Russia. It was the land par excellence of censorship and police. In the long run this was bound to exclude certain possibilities of modernization, though other obstacles rooted in Russian society seem equally important, but in the short run it was highly successful. Russia passed through the whole 19th century without revolution. Revolts in Russian Poland in 1830-1 and 1863-4 were ruthlessly suppressed, the more easily because Poles and Russians cherished traditions of mutual dislike. The other side of the coin was the almost continuous violence and disorder of a savage and primitive rural society, and a mounting and more violent tradition of conspiracy, which perhaps incapacitated Russia even further for normal politics and the shared assumptions they required. Unfriendly critics variously described Nicholas's reign as an ice age, a plague zone and a prison, But not for the last time in Russian history, the preservation of a harsh and unyielding despotism at home was not incompatible with a strong international role. This rested upon Russia's huge military superiority. When armies contended with muzzle-loaders and no important weaponry distinguished one from another, her vast numbers were decisive. On Russian military strength rested the anti-revolutionary international security system, as 1849 showed. But Russian foreign policy had other successes, too. Pressure was consistently kept up on the Central Asian Khanates and on China. The left bank of the Amur became Russian, and in 1860 Vladivostok was founded. Great concessions were exacted from Persia, and during the 19th century Russia absorbed Georgia and a part of Armenia. For a time there was even a determined effort to pursue Russian expansion in North America, where there were forts in Alaska and settlements in Northern California until the 1840s. The major effort of Russian foreign policy, nevertheless, was directed to the southwest, towards Ottoman Europe. Wars in 1806–12 and 1828 carried the Russian frontier across Bessarabia to the Pruth and the mouth of the Danube. It was by then clear that the partition of the Ottoman Empire in Europe would be as central to 19th-century diplomacy as the partition of Poland had been to that of the 18th. But there was an important difference: the interests of more powers were involved this time, and the complicating factor of national sentiment among the subject peoples of the Ottoman Empire would make an agreed outcome much more difficult. As it happened, the Ottoman Empire survived far longer than might have been expected, and an Eastern question is still bothering statesmen. Some of these complicating factors led to the Crimean War, which began with a Russian occupation of Ottoman provinces on the lower Danube. In Russia's internal affairs, the war was more important than in those of any other country. It revealed that the military colossus of the 1815 Restoration now no longer enjoyed an unquestioned superiority. She was defeated on her own territory and obliged to accept a peace which involved the renunciation for the foreseeable future of her traditional goals in the Black Sea area. Fortunately, in the middle of the war Nicholas I had died. This simplified the problems of his successor. Defeat meant that change had to come. Some modernization of Russian institutions was unavoidable if Russia was again to generate a power commensurate with her vast potential, which had become unrealizable within her traditional framework. When the Crimean War broke out, there was still no Russian railway south of Moscow. Russia's once important contribution to European industrial production had hardly grown since 1800 and was now far outstripped by others. Her agriculture remained one of the least productive in the world, and yet her population steadily rose, pressing harder upon its resources. It was in these circumstances that Russia at last underwent radical change. Though less dramatic than many upheavals in the rest of Europe, it was in fact more of a revolution than much that went by that name elsewhere, for what was at last uprooted was the institution which lay at the very roots of Russian life: serfdom. Its extension had been the leading characteristic of Russian social history since the 17th century. Even Nicholas had agreed that serfdom was the central evil of Russian society. His reign had been marked by increasingly frequent serf insurrections, attacks on landlords, crop burning and cattle maiming. The refusal of Jews was almost the least alarming form of popular resistance to it. Yet it was appallingly difficult for the rider to get off the elephant. The vast majority of Russians were serfs. They could not be transformed overnight by mere legislative fiat into wage laborers or smallholders, nor could the state accept the administrative burden which would suddenly be thrown upon it if the services discharged by the manorial system should be withdrawn and nothing put in their place. Nicholas had not dared to proceed. Alexander II did. After years of study of the evidence and the possible advantages and disadvantages of different forms of abolition, the Tsar issued in 1861 the edict which marked an epoch in Russian history and won him the title of the Tsar Liberator. The one card Russian government could play was the unquestioned authority of the autocrat, and it was now put to good use. The edict gave the serfs personal freedom and ended bond labor. It also gave them allotments of land. But these were to be paid for by redemption charges whose purpose was to make the change acceptable to the landowners. To secure the repayments and offset the dangers of suddenly introducing a free labor market, peasants remained to a considerable degree subject to the authority of their village communities, which were given the charge of distributing the land allotments on a family basis. It would not be long before a great deal would be heard about the shortcomings of this settlement. Yet there is much to be said for it, and in retrospect it seems a massive achievement. Within a few years the United States would emancipate its black slaves. There were far fewer of them than there were Russian serfs, and they lived in a country of much greater economic opportunity, yet the effect of throwing them on the labor market, exposed to the pure theory of laissez-faire economic liberalism, was to exacerbate a problem with whose ultimate consequences the United States was still grappling a century later. In Russia, the largest measure of social engineering in recorded history down to this time was carried out without comparable dislocation, and it opened the way to modernization for what was potentially one of the strongest powers on earth. It was the indispensable first step towards making the peasant look beyond the estate for available industrial employment. More immediately, liberation opened an era of reform. There followed other measures which by 1870 gave Russia a representative system of local government and a reformed judiciary. When, in 1871, the Russians took advantage of the Franco-Prussian War to denounce some of the restrictions placed on their freedom in the Black Sea in 1856, there was almost a symbolic warning to Europe in what they did. After tackling her greatest problem and beginning to modernize her institutions, Russia was again announcing that she would after all be master in her own house. The resumption of the most consistently and long-pursued policies of expansion in modern history was only a matter of time.